Of the three former Minneapolis police officers, the superior officer, Derek Chauvin, pleaded guilty to the charges they are also facing. Now, we asked our viewers, do you think these three officers are just as responsible as Chauvin for violating the civil rights of George Floyd? All right, still with me, trial attorney Matthew Barhoma. And Matthew, our first comment comes from Eric Jones. Eric wrote in part, I believe every one of them should be charged the same as Chauvin, but give the guy that was training the option for parole after about 10 years, because although he was training, he knew the man was dying, even spoke up about being worried about him dying, and still helped. All right, so Matthew, I mean, it's an interesting point because, again, we keep talking about the idea that perhaps all three of these guys were situated differently. And that particular viewer thinks that Lane, I think that's the one he's referring to, was really the youngest of them, and I mean, not the youngest, but the one who had the least time on the job, deferring to the older officer, and that perhaps they should get less time. We know that Chauvin's facing 25 years. Your thoughts on perhaps, if they are found guilty, that they face a lesser punishment?
Yep, and that's exactly it, Michael. I think that Eric has already jumped over to a conviction. Let's see if the prosecution can finalize this case to bar. But if they do, I think that Eric is onto something very good, which is that he's differentiating here between the amount of culpability, the amount of liability, ultimately. And that's exactly what this court is tasked with here. They're going to have to show, or this court's going to basically have discretion in being able to attribute liability to each of these, especially within the sentencing guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, part of that falls on the prosecutors as well, because they're the one that make recommendations, correct?
Well, absolutely. In a sentencing setting, they make recommendations. The judge ultimately will have some level of discretion in being able to impose midterms, high terms, and this kind of discretion is built in for judges so that they could attribute exactly what Eric is hinting on, which is level of retribution.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. They do face life in prison if it can be proven that death resulted as a result of the violation of Floyd's civil rights. But that is pretty much off the table. That's very rare in these circumstances. All right, our next comment comes from Kathleen Lyons. Kathleen says they're being railroaded. The prosecution already coming down heavy while the Floyd family voices their demands. It doesn't look good for the officers, no matter how competent their defense. The case has been political from the beginning. Matthew, I want to get your comment on that. There is a sense that there is a political nature to this case, but I do think crimes were committed as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the struggle here. That is the issue here. But ultimately, you know, there's been one level of fault here on Chauvin, and ultimately, how much level of fault to fall throughout is really, you know, truly what's at stake. Now, ultimately, you know, how they are able to gain this conviction and you know, how they can get it really is going to fall a lot in part on these political issues, and being able to decipher through that and be able to move through that is really going to be ultimately the winning side. The side that's able to do this best is the side that's going to be able to possibly render a verdict that's in their favor.
Absolutely. Let's go to our next comment. It comes from Christine Alvarez Stewart. Christine writes, guilty, guilty, and guilty, no doubt about it, all right? She has her opinion on that, and that may, in fact, be the case. But I think, you know, it's one of those cases that I think, as you said, is going to boil down to how both sides play it in this case. I think the federal case, a little more difficult than the state case, so we'll be watching closely. All right, Matthew, I want to thank you so much for all your insights and for being with us tonight. Always a pleasure. I'm Michael Ayala. It's been